Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please. In the blue corner, wearing white trunks from Louisville, Kentucky, a true genius of the ring and champion of the people, Muhammad Ali. And in the red corner, wearing a cape and blue tights from the planet Krypton, Kal-El fighting as Superman, also champion of the people. In 1978, DC Comics published an oversized comic book about the greatest event of the 1970s. The fight of the century. Superman versus Muhammad Ali. This story was plotted by Dennis O'Neil and adapted by Neal Adams, in what is now considered one of the single greatest graphic novels that has ever been created. And we know this is a 100% certified fact because of the introduction written by Neal Adams on the 2010 republishing of this epic tale, where he tells you this is one of the single greatest graphic novels ever created. As you can see, like Muhammad Ali, Neal Adams is well known for being modest. In the following presentation, I'll be discussing the creation of the strangest and most enduring team-up comic book ever created, by first situating this comic book within the historical context in which it was released by analyzing this moment in history through the lens of Muhammad Ali's career. Next, I will summarize the plot and creation of this unlikely comic book. And lastly, I will end this presentation by addressing the lasting legacy of this epic tale and the impact it continues to have. Before I begin discussing the creation of this comic book, it's important to first situate the comic within its historical context. And the best way to do that is to analyze this moment in time through the lens of Muhammad Ali's boxing career. Ali is considered one of the most significant sports figures of the 20th century. In 1961, Cassius Clay won the World Heavyweight Championship by defeating Sonny Liston in a major upset at the age of 22. During that year, he denounced his birth name as a slave name and firmly changed his name to Muhammad Ali after becoming a devoted Muslim and converting to the Nation of Islam. In April of 1967, Ali was scheduled to be inducted into the draft for the Vietnam War, but refused. He was later stripped of his heavyweight championship, which resulted in 3.5 years of inactivity for his boxing career. It was during that time that Ali became the most visible symbol of the Black Power movement's radical critique of American imperialism, structural racism, and white supremacy. In October of 1970, Ali was finally allowed to return to boxing, but his skills have eroded. And while his reflexes were still superb, he was no longer as fast as he used to be, which resulted in him losing his shot at the title against Joe Frazier upon their first meeting. In 1974, Ali shocked the world by defeating George Foreman, who had previously pulverized Frazier in a fight that only lasted 2 rounds. It was after this fight that Ali's image had begun to change in the American public. For a while, Ali was despised by white Americans for his loudmouth personality, his religious affiliations, and political dissent regarding the Vietnam War. After defeating Foreman, Ali became a cultural icon. He became the greatest. By 1976, as world champion, Ali became a folk hero, and so DC Comics decided to publish a story that brought together Superman and Ali in a quest to save the Earth against an alien invasion. However, while the creation of this comic began in 1976, it was not completed until 1978, the same year that Ali would end up losing his heavyweight championship to Leon Spinks. More on that later. Before I discuss the creation of this epic crossover event, let me first briefly summarize this comic book's wacky plot. The comic's plot revolves around an alien race called the Scrub, who wanted to pit their champion against the greatest fighter on Earth. If he lost, Earth would be destroyed. Superman, who many would consider to be a likely choice, offered to fight for Earth, but Ali suggested that he would be a better representative as a human rather than an exile from the planet Krypton. So the two entered a qualifying boxing match. To make the fight fair, Superman and Ali make a journey to the Fortress of Solitude to temporarily deactivate Superman's powers by using a fragment of a red sun. Remember, Superman is powered by Earth's yellow sun, and so the bout between these two icons takes place in a ring orbiting a red sun to provide an even playing field. When the two face off in the ring to see who the defender of Earth will be, Ali comes out victorious in a one-sided battle. But it's important to note that Superman showed a lot of heart in his match against Ali and only hit the canvas after the match was called. After the bout, the duo must work together to defeat the Scrub while Ali takes on their champion and Superman battles the Scrub Space Armada. Spoiler alert, Ali and Superman come out on top of their battles, and this epic story ends with the 2 icons embracing each other as the greatest. As often is the case with the documentation of history, there are usually three sides to every story. There is his story, her story, and the truth. Unfortunately, in the case of the creation of Superman vs. Muhammad Ali, the truth is not exactly very clear. In two separate interviews with Denny O'Neil and Neal Adams, they claim that the original concept for Superman vs. Muhammad Ali was originated by Julie Schwartz, who was DC's primary editor for the company's flagship superheroes at the time. However, Jeanette Kahn, who was a publisher at DC, disputes this claim and states that the idea came from Ali's promoter/manager, Don King. Kahn claims that Don King proposed this idea to DC Comics at the DC offices at 75 Rockefeller Plaza in 1976. So, who created this concept? I guess the answer is for you to decide who you trust more. Before the creation of this comic, Ali's team wanted to prove his likeness for this crossover event first. So DC hired Joe Kubert to work on the cover art. However, according to Neal Adams, Ali and his team had issues with the ways in which Kubert was portraying Ali's likeness, and so DC hired Neal Adams as the artist for this comic. The original creative team behind this project had Dennis O'Neil writing, Neal Adams doing the artwork, and Julie Schwartz as the editor. This seemed like the perfect team to take on this monumental task because O'Neil and Adams already made history with their socially conscious Green Lantern and Green Arrow series. As admirers of Muhammad Ali, both Adams and O'Neil were laser focused on doing justice to Ali's image. According to Adams, quote, "This was not a comic book that was done by accident. This book rubs shoulders with Ali. It takes him out of the myth and makes him a human being. Heroes are meant to be walked down the street with. You walk down the street with them. You find out who they are. If they're good guys. Some heroes are not good guys. Ali very clearly was a good guy." The process of honoring Ali's image began with getting his dialogue correct. In order to do this, Dennis O'Neil visited Ali in 1976 at a mountain resort where he was training for his rematch with Ken Norton. It was there where O'Neil paid close attention to Ali's speech patterns. Neal Adams, on the other hand, would quote Ali verbatim when he took over the comic. You see, O'Neil is only credited with creating the plot and outline for the story. Both Adams and O'Neil claim to not remember why Dennis stepped down halfway through the creation of this project. But after he left, Neal Adams claims that, quote, "Essentially Julie Schwartz dumped it into my lap." And thus, he had to finish creating the script prior to drawing the comic. In terms of drawing Ali, Adams researched his footwork and fighting style to authentically capture his movement in the boxing ring. This resulted in hyper-realistic illustrations that look like they could almost be photographs. In my opinion, Adams' approach to realism when drawing Ali is perhaps the most appealing aspect of this otherwise goofy story. I mean, just look at the attention to detail. It's truly something to marvel at. As I stated earlier, something that's interesting about this comic is that it took 2 years to complete. By the time the title was released in 1978, Muhammad Ali was actually no longer the heavyweight champion of the world after suffering a devastating loss to Leon Spinks. However, Ali went on to regain his title in September of that year, just around the time the comic was just published. So it ended up working out in the long run. In the next slide, I'll discuss some of the issues that Neal Adams and Dennis O'Neil encountered when creating this comic. So, why exactly did this comic take so long to create? One issue that both Neal Adams and Dennis O'Neil cite was that it took a while for this project to be approved. However, it was not DC Comics that needed to approve this project. They needed approval from the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad. According to Neal Adams, him and O'Neil had to take a flight to Chicago and visit Elijah Muhammad at his home. However, this could not have been true because by all accounts, this project began its development in 1976. And Elijah Muhammad died on February 25th, 1975. Also, there's a question about what exactly did Elijah Muhammad need to approve. Superman vs. Muhammad Ali provides a very sanitized portrayal of Ali's public image and makes zero mention about his political stances, the Vietnam War, or Islam. So the question arises, why would Elijah Muhammad need to grant approval from the grave for a comic that makes no reference to Islam or religion whatsoever? The answer is that he couldn't have. However, it is possible that Adams and O'Neil might have needed to get approval from either Don King or a representative from the Nation of Islam. One issue that is not disputed, however, is that this comic was severely delayed from its 1977 release date due to issues regarding using public figures' likeness for the cover. Superman vs. Muhammad Ali has perhaps one of the most epic comic book covers of all time. As stated earlier, artist Joe Kubert was hired by DC to draw the cover for this epic crossover issue. But for some reason, Muhammad Ali's people weren't happy with the likeness, and somehow the idea came up, maybe we can get Neal to work on it. When Neal Adams took over the project, Kubert's cover had no background details. However, what it did have was an amazing layout of Ali and Superman facing off against each other in the ring. Thus, Adams thought to himself, quote, gee, no matter what I do, I don't think I'm going to come up with a better layout than Joe. So, I essentially took his layout and just put my drawing into it. And if somebody recognized the pose of, say, Superman as not being a typical Neal Adams pose, it's because it's a Joe Kubert pose, adapted to my style. Unquote. Knowing that this was going to be an oversized issue, Adams knew that it would have to have a wraparound cover, and thus the idea came to Adams to make this into a giant sports event with famous people in the crowd watching the fight. Thus, Adams began drawing a variety of famous celebrities and public figures from the 1970s, such as John Wayne, President Jimmy Carter, Cher, Kurt Vonnegut, the Jackson 5, Andy Warhol, and Batman, to name a few. And thus what we get is this epic wraparound cover that includes a variety of celebrities, DC comic creators and staffers, and some popular DC comic book superheroes. However, after the creation of the cover, a new problem arose that stalled the comic's 1977 release date. DC did not get permission to use these public figures' likeness. And while a majority of these stars loved the idea of Superman vs. Muhammad Ali and happily signed on to be part of the cover, others unequivocally said no. To get around this issue, Adams had to either erase each character's face or take some creative liberties. For example, John Wayne was one of the celebrities that refused to be part of the cover, and Neal Adams did not want to erase his cowboy hat. So, he opted to just provide John Wayne with a mustache, so nobody would notice that it's him. And remember, this is the 1970s, so big goofy mustaches were common during this time. So my question to the class is, can any of you recognize or point out some of the celebrities and or DC staffers in attendance? Well, if you can't, it's okay, because there are more than 150 celebrity cameos on the cover. And luckily, DC Comics provided its readers with this lovely cheat sheet. In 1978, a publicist for DC Comics named Mike Gold organized a press conference for Muhammad Ali. At the press conference, reporters began to ask Ali questions about his upcoming fight against Leon Spinks. However, Ali refused to answer any questions about his upcoming bout and instead picked up an oversized comic book and said that he was only there to promote one fight, and that was against Superman. This promotion was considered a success because comic books did not get this type of media exposure in 1978, and Mike Gold was offered a job by both Bob Arum and Don King, the two leading boxing promoters at the time. But Mike Gold ended up politely refusing the job offer. Today, Superman vs. Muhammad Ali is now considered one of DC's best-selling comic books, having been repeatedly reprinted over the years in several different languages. In 2010, it was given a new release in two hardcover formats. One as a deluxe hardcover format with a new cover and additional material, and one which prints in its original Treasury edition height and width. And with 7 printings in the last 12 years, which is pretty unusual for such a slim cover, it is now considered one of the best-selling perennial collections at DC Comics. However, this story does not end here because the impact of Superman vs. Muhammad Ali has created a ripple effect that continues to be felt to this day. In the year 2000, Neal Adams was hired by ESPN magazine to draw a similar cover pitting Ali against the most significant sports icon of the 1990s, Michael Jordan. As you can see, this cover features a similar layout to the Superman vs. Muhammad Ali cover, but instead of featuring celebrities, DC creators or comic book characters in the crowd, we see a variety of sports icons such as Babe Ruth on the lower right side of the page, Magic Johnson on the lower left, and for some reason, Mr. Ed, America's favorite talking horse, is in attendance. In 2015, Neal Adams was hired as the artist for Harley's Little Black Book number 5, written by Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Conner. As you can see from the cover, this story is an homage to O'Neil and Adams' 1978 classic, and is essentially an homage to Ali by proxy, by having Harley stand in for the heavyweight champ, as she is pitted against Superman to save the world from, you guessed correctly, an alien invasion. As you can see, Neal Adams essentially recreates his classic cover with Harley Quinn standing in for Ali, and you can also see some new faces in the crowd, with perhaps the most visible being Barack Obama and Michelle Obama on the lower right-hand side of the page, taking over the spot that was once held by Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. Another notable appearance that we see in the crowd is former President Donald Trump, who claims that this alien invasion would not have happened under his watch because he would have built a huge wall around the earth by getting the aliens to pay for it. Yes, that happens. And as you can see, this comic tells a very similar story to Superman vs. Muhammad Ali, and at times can be viewed as a shot-for-shot recreation of this epic tale. I mean, just look how similar the opening page and last pages are in both comics. They kind of act as time capsules for the time period in which these comics were released. And here's some other snapshots from both comics that you can compare and contrast to kind of give you an idea for how Little Harley's Black Book is essentially paying an homage to the original comic. Like I said before, these are pretty much shot-for-shot recreations. However, it's not entirely fair to call this a shot-for-shot recreation per se, because Jimmy Palmiotti and Amanda Conner take some creative liberties with the story, with perhaps one of the most notable changes coming in the form of Harley Quinn taking off her gloves and playing dirty to come out victorious in her bout. More recently, in 2020, the National Entertainment Collectible Association released some Superman vs. Muhammad Ali action figures to honor this classic comic book. As you can see, these figures capture Neal Adams' style, these icons, about as perfectly as one possibly can. And lastly, Ali's image and legacy continues to be revived in comic book form to this day. One example of this includes the biographic novel Muhammad Ali by Sybil Tithieu Delacroix, which was published by Dark Horse Comics in 2015. And the most recent graphic novel, which was published in 2021, is titled Muhammad Ali Kinshasa, 1974, by Jean David Morvan and Rafael Ortiz, which tells the story of Ali defeating George Foreman in the Rumble in the Jungle. And it looks like we have reached the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and if you have yet to read this classic crossover comic book event, I highly recommend checking it out. It truly should not be as good as it is. Thank you, and goodbye.